August 6, 1945. 8:15 a.m., Hiroshima, Japan. A 29-year-old engineer named Tsutomu Yamaguchi is walking to work. It's his last day on a business trip. Tomorrow, he'll board a train home to Nagasaki to see his wife and infant son. The morning is warm. The sky is clear. It's a perfect summer day. He looks up and sees a B-29 bomber flying high overhead. Something falls from the plane. 2 parachutes. He wonders what it could be. Supply drop? Leaflets. Then, nothing. No sound. Just a flash of light brighter than the sun itself. For a fraction of a second, the sky turns white, pure, blinding white. Then the shock wave hits. In that instant, 80,000 people cease to exist. Their bodies vaporized, their shadows burned into stone, their final moments frozen forever on walls and pavement. But here's what most people don't know. Japan didn't surrender. Not that day, not the next day, not even after the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki 3 days later. The Japanese government held an emergency meeting and argued. They debated. They stalled. So why did Japan finally give up? Was it the bombs that ended the war? Or was it something else entirely, something the history books barely mention? Today, we're going to uncover the real reason Japan surrendered. We'll reveal the secret Soviet invasion that terrified Japanese leaders more than nuclear weapons. And we'll tell the story that legendary filmmaker James Cameron is now bringing to the screen in what he calls his most terrifying and personal project, Ghosts of Hiroshima.
By the summer of 1945, Japan was already a broken nation. American forces had captured Iwo Jima in one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. Nearly 7,000 Americans died, but Japan lost 18,000 defenders, almost the entire garrison. They fought to the last man. Okinawa was even worse. The battle lasted 82 days. Over 12,000 Americans were killed, but Japan lost over 100,000 soldiers. Thousands more civilians committed suicide rather than surrender to American forces. Kamikaze pilots flew one-way missions into American ships because Japan had run out of fuel for return trips. Young men, barely trained, climbed into aircraft loaded with explosives and flew them straight into enemy vessels. Over 3,000 kamikaze pilots died in the final months of the war. Japanese cities were being systematically destroyed from the air. American B-29 bombers flew night after night, dropping incendiary bombs that created firestorms in densely packed urban areas. On the night of March 9, 1945, over 300 B-29s dropped napalm and incendiary clusters on Tokyo. The fires merged into a single inferno. The heat was so intense it created hurricane-force winds that sucked people into the flames. Over 100,000 civilians died in that one night, more than would die in Hiroshima. The Japanese Navy was crippled. Most of its carriers and battleships had been sunk. The Air Force was grounded. No fuel, no pilots, no planes. The empire was starving. American submarines had choked off supply lines. Rations were cut to barely survival levels. Millions faced starvation. Yet Japan's military leadership, a group known as the Big Six of the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, refused to surrender. Why? Because surrender wasn't just military defeat. It was the end of everything Japan believed in. The Big Six and the Emperor. The Big Six consisted of Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, a retired admiral in his 70s, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, one of the few moderates in the government. Army Minister Korichika Anami, a hardliner who believed Japan should fight to the death. Navy Minister Yonimasa Yonai, a moderate who understood the war was lost. Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, another hardliner determined never to surrender. Navy Chief of Staff Soimu Toyoda, the last military leader still clinging to hope. 3 of them were moderates who understood Japan was finished. 3 were hardliners who believed death was preferable to dishonor. Every major decision required unanimous agreement from all 6. That meant they were perpetually deadlocked. The hardliners had one unshakable demand. Japan would never accept unconditional surrender. The reason? Emperor Hirohito. Emperor Hirohito wasn't just Japan's political leader. He was considered a living god, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. His existence was the spiritual foundation of the entire empire. The Allies' demand for unconditional surrender meant the emperor's fate would be decided by foreigners. He could be removed from power, tried as a war criminal, even executed. To Japan's military elite, that was worse than death itself. So they devised a desperate plan: stall for time, negotiate with the Soviet Union, and secure a conditional peace that would preserve the emperor and avoid Allied occupation of the home islands. Japan had signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union in 1941. While the Soviets were fighting Germany in the West, they had stayed out of the Pacific War. Japanese leaders believed Stalin might broker a peace deal in exchange for territorial concessions. They sent diplomatic envoys to Moscow. They waited for a response. They prayed for a miracle. There was just one problem. The Soviets were lying to them. The Manhattan Project. While Japan gambled everything on Soviet mediation, the United States was finalizing work on the most destructive weapon in human history. The Manhattan Project had begun in 1942 as a secret effort to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could. The project cost $2 billion, nearly $30 billion in today's money, and employed over 130,000 people across dozens of secret facilities. At its heart was a team of brilliant scientists led by physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. They worked in a secret laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico, racing to turn theoretical physics into a working weapon. On July 16, 1945, they succeeded. The first atomic bomb was detonated in the New Mexico desert. The explosion created a mushroom cloud that rose over 40,000 feet into the air. Observers 10 miles away felt the heat on their faces. The shock wave shattered windows 120 miles away. Oppenheimer, watching the fireball rise, later recalled a line from Hindu scripture: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." President Truman had only learned the bomb existed after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April. Now he faced an impossible choice. American military planners estimated that invading the Japanese home islands would cost between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. Japanese casualties would be in the millions. The entire civilian population had been mobilized to resist. Women and children were being trained to fight with bamboo spears. Or Truman could use this new weapon and end the war immediately. On July 26, 1945, the Allied powers issued the Potsdam Declaration. It demanded Japan's unconditional surrender and promised prompt and utter destruction if they refused. Japan's government publicly rejected it. The Prime Minister called it unworthy of public notice. Privately, they were still waiting for Stalin to save them. It was the biggest miscalculation of the war. because Stalin had already decided to stab them in the back.
The B-29 bomber, Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, approached Hiroshima at 31,000 feet. The bomb, a uranium device nicknamed Little Boy, hung in the bomb bay. It weighed nearly 10,000 pounds. Tibbets gave the order. The bombardier released the weapon. It fell for 43 seconds. At exactly 1,900 feet above the ground, an altitude sensor triggered the detonation. The uranium core went critical. In a millionth of a second, it released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The fireball reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun. Everything within a half-mile radius was vaporized instantly. Stone melted, metal turned to liquid, human beings simply ceased to exist. Further out, the blast wave traveled at over 1,000 miles per hour. Buildings were flattened like cardboard. People were thrown through the air like rag dolls. The thermal pulse came next, a wave of radiant heat that ignited everything flammable for miles. Clothing burst into flames. Skin was seared off exposed flesh. People's eyeballs boiled in their sockets. Then came the fires. Thousands of individual fires merged into a single firestorm that consumed what was left of the city. In an instant, 80,000 people died. By the end of the year, that number would reach 140,000, as radiation sickness claimed thousands more. But some people survived, even close to ground zero. People who happened to be in basements, behind thick concrete walls, in just the right shadow at just the right moment. One of them was Tsutomu Yamaguchi. Tsutomu Yamaguchi's first bomb. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was 1.8 miles from ground zero when the bomb detonated. He was walking across an open field toward the Mitsubishi shipyard where he worked as a marine engineer. It was his last day on a 3-month business trip designing oil tankers. He was thinking about going home, about seeing his wife, Hisako, and their infant son. Then he saw the B-29. He saw something fall from it. 2 objects descending on parachutes. He remembers thinking, what could that be? Then the sky turned white. He later described it as like the lightning of a huge magnesium flare. The light was so bright he could see the bones in his hands through his skin. He threw himself to the ground. The shockwave hit a second later, a wall of compressed air that felt like being hit by a freight train. His eardrums ruptured. The skin on his face and arms was seared by the flash. His hair was singed. When he stood up, Hiroshima was gone. Every building he could see had been flattened. Fires were spreading everywhere. The air was thick with black smoke and falling ash. And there were bodies. Thousands of bodies. Some were charred beyond recognition. Others were still alive, walking, stumbling, crawling. Many were naked, their clothing burned away. Their skin hung off their bodies in sheets. People staggered toward the river, begging for water. When they reached the water, many collapsed and drowned. Yamaguchi stumbled through the ruins in shock. He had no idea what had hit the city. An earthquake? A new kind of bomb? He made it to a train station. Miraculously, some trains were still running, carrying survivors out of the city. He boarded one, his face and arms covered in severe burns, his ears ringing so badly he could barely hear. The train's destination? Nagasaki. Tokyo is silence. News reached Tokyo slowly. Communications with Hiroshima had been cut off, radio signals dead, phone lines silent. By midday, the government knew something catastrophic had happened. Reconnaissance planes reported that the entire city had been destroyed. But the Big Six didn't convene an emergency meeting. They didn't issue orders. They waited. Why? Because they still believed they had time. Japanese intelligence had correctly assessed that the United States wouldn't be ready to invade the home islands until November 1945 at the earliest, possibly not until the spring of 1946.
That gave them months to negotiate with the Soviets. Hiroshima was a tragedy, but it didn't fundamentally change the strategic situation. Besides, they reasoned, surely the Americans couldn't have many more of these superbombs. Building such a weapon must take enormous resources and time. They were wrong on both counts. The Americans had another bomb ready to go, and the Soviets were about to make their move. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the leaders of the Allied powers gathered to plan the final stages of World War II. Joseph Stalin made a secret promise. The Soviet Union would declare war on Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. In exchange, the Soviets would receive territory in the Far East, including the Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin, lost to Japan in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. That meant Stalin's deadline was August 8, 1945. For months, Soviet diplomats had been stringing Japan along. They refused to meet with Japanese envoys. They delayed responses to peace proposals. They offered vague promises of considering Japan's requests for mediation. Meanwhile, along the Manchurian border, the Soviet Union was assembling the largest invasion force in its history. Over 1.5 million troops, 5,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, 5,000 aircraft, 86,000 motor vehicles. It was a force larger than the one that had crushed Nazi Germany. And it was aimed directly at Japan's last major field army, the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. August 8th, the Soviets strike. Just after midnight on August 9, 1945, exactly 3 months after Germany's surrender, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. There was no warning, no ultimatum, just a declaration and invasion. Within hours, Soviet forces smashed across the border from 3 directions simultaneously. The Kwantung Army, once considered the elite of the Japanese military, was undermanned, under-equipped, and completely unprepared. Most of its best units had been transferred south to defend the home islands. The Soviets destroyed them in days. Tank columns raced across the Manchurian plains, encircling Japanese positions. Soviet aircraft bombed cities and rail lines. Paratroopers seized key airfields. It was a masterclass in modern combined arms warfare, and it terrified Japanese leaders far more than the atomic bombs. Why? Because it meant Japan's last hope was gone. As long as the Soviets stayed neutral, Japan believed it could negotiate a conditional peace, preserving the emperor and avoiding occupation. The moment Stalin declared war, that option vanished. Now Japan faced enemies on every side. American fleets surrounding the home islands, American bombers destroying its cities, and Soviet armies pouring into Manchuria. There was no way out. The Big Six, still deadlocked. At 10:30 a.m. on August 9th, the Big Six finally gathered for an emergency meeting at the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Foreign Minister Togo argued for immediate surrender. The Soviet invasion, he said, made continued resistance meaningless. Army Minister Anami refused. Japan must fight to the death. Surrender was unthinkable. The debate raged for hours. And then, just after 11 a.m., they received word a second atomic bomb had just been dropped. Target: Nagasaki. Tsusumu Yamaguchi's second bomb. Yamaguchi had made it home to Nagasaki on August 8th, despite his severe burns and ruptured eardrums. On the morning of August 9th, he dragged himself to work at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. His supervisors were shocked at his injuries. He tried to explain what had happened in Hiroshima. One bomb, the entire city destroyed. They didn't believe him. "You're telling us one bomb destroyed an entire city?" His colleagues scoffed. "Impossible. You must have been delirious." Yamaguchi was insistent. He warned them, "If you see a bright flash without sound, any flash at all, dive for cover immediately. Don't look at it. Don't hesitate. Just hit the ground." At 11:02 a.m., Yamaguchi was in a meeting with his department head when the room suddenly lit up. His co-workers saw the flash and remembered his warning. They threw themselves to the floor. The shock wave hit seconds later, shattering windows and blowing Yamaguchi across the room. When the dust settled, he and his co-workers were bruised and cut, but alive. Tsusumu Yamaguchi had just survived his second atomic bombing in 3 days. He would become the only person officially recognized by the Japanese government as a survivor of both atomic bombings. Over 73,000 people in Nagasaki were not as fortunate. Many died instantly. Thousands more would die of radiation sickness in the weeks and months that followed. Japan had been hit by 2 atomic bombs in 3 days. And still, the Big Six could not agree to surrender.
So what really forced Japan to surrender? For decades, the dominant narrative in the West has been simple. The atomic bombs ended the war. Truman dropped the bombs, Japan surrendered, and 1 million lives were saved. But the historical evidence tells a more complicated story. The bombs versus the Soviet invasion. Historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa spent decades researching this question. He examined Japanese, American, and Soviet archives. His conclusion? The Soviet invasion was the decisive factor, not the atomic bombs. Here's why. First, Japan had already endured massive strategic bombing campaigns. The Tokyo firebombing killed more people in one night than died at Hiroshima. Over 60 Japanese cities had been devastated by conventional bombing. Japanese leaders were tragically desensitized to civilian casualties. Second, the atomic bombs didn't fundamentally change Japan's military position. Japan was already losing. Its navy was destroyed, its air force grounded, its cities in ruins. 2 more destroyed cities, however horrifically, didn't alter that reality. Third, the Soviet invasion destroyed Japan's last diplomatic option. As long as the Soviets stayed neutral, Japan believed it could negotiate a conditional peace. The moment Stalin declared war, that hope evaporated. Emperor Hirohito himself made this clear in his address to the military, explaining his decision. He spent most of his time discussing the Soviet invasion, saying it threatened the very foundation of the empire's existence. Japan could not fight the United States and the Soviet Union simultaneously. The entry of Soviet forces meant the home islands could be invaded from the north while the Americans attacked from the south. The atomic bombs gave Japan a face-saving way to surrender. They could tell their people and themselves that they had been defeated by a revolutionary new weapon, not by conventional military failure. But it was the Soviet betrayal that truly shattered their will to continue. James Cameron's Ghosts of Hiroshima. In 2025, legendary director James Cameron announced he would adapt Charles Pellegrino's book, Ghosts of Hiroshima, into a feature film. It will be his first non-Avatar project in 30 years, and he calls it the most challenging, terrifying, and important film of his career. Cameron plans to shoot the film in 3D, placing audiences at ground zero during the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. "I want to show you what it was like," Cameron said in an interview. "You're just there. You're a witness. I intend to be unflinching. I won't pull any punches."
The film will center on Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the man who survived both atomic bombs. Cameron actually met Yamaguchi in a hospital in Nagasaki in early 2010, just days before Yamaguchi's death from stomach cancer at age 93. Yamaguchi handed Cameron his story and made him promise to share it with the world. "My double radiation exposure is now an official government record. It can tell the younger generation the horrifying history of the atomic bombings even after I die." Cameron intends to honor that promise. He's not making this film for spectacle or entertainment. He's making it as a warning. Because the ghosts of Hiroshima aren't just shadows burned into stone. They're the 200,000 to 250,000 lives lost in the bombings and their aftermath. They're the survivors, like Tsutomu Yamaguchi, who carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. And they're a warning to every generation that follows. Nuclear weapons must never be used again. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, humanity crossed the threshold it can never uncross. We became the only species in history to use nuclear weapons in warfare. The atomic bombings killed 250,000 people. Tens of thousands more died in the years that followed from radiation-induced cancers and other illnesses. But the bombs alone didn't end the war. It took a combination of factors: atomic destruction, Soviet invasion, the emperor's personal intervention, and the failure of a military coup. James Cameron's Ghosts of Hiroshima will show us what that moment truly looked like. Not from 30,000 feet up in a bomber, but from the ground. From the perspective of people like Tsutomu Yamaguchi, who survived both bombs and spent the rest of his life bearing witness. Because the shadows burned into stone in Hiroshima are still there today. Still visible. Still waiting. Still asking humanity, will we remember the horror of what we created? Or will we forget until it happens again? That's a question James Cameron wants every viewer to carry with them when they leave the theater. And it's a question we all must answer.